Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal interesting details on Thursday, September 11, 2025. First, Jason's return to Port Charles with Britt sent shockwaves throughout the town, not only because of the danger he faced in bringing her back, but also because everyone had long believed Britt was dead. Her sudden reappearance challenged the certainty of memory and grief that many had been carrying for months. Jason had endured risks that few could imagine to ensure Britt's survival, and his stoic determination became the unspoken thread pulling her back into the heart of Port Charles. What should have been an ending became a startling new beginning, and the streets that had mourned Britt now buzzed with whispers and disbelief about her miraculous return. For Britt, the return itself was overwhelming. She had lived in the shadows for so long, torn between survival and the weight of being forgotten, and now she was suddenly thrust back into a world that had already moved on without her. The disbelief in the eyes of those she encountered was matched only by her own uncertainty about what awaited her. Port Charles was not the same place she had left, and she was not the same woman. Her survival carried scars, both visible and hidden, and although she stood on familiar ground, it felt alien, as though her second chance came with new, unspoken demands. The reunion with her mother was perhaps the most emotionally charged moment. Lulu, who had clung to fragments of hope even when all signs pointed to loss, was consumed by an almost unbearable joy at seeing her daughter alive. Tears of relief softened her usual steel, and for once the weight of resilience gave way to pure maternal gratitude. The bond between them, often tested by ambition and mistrust, found a moment of raw healing. It was not just the return of a daughter, it was the restoration of something that Lulu thought she had been robbed of forever, a victory against fate itself. Not everyone in Port Charles welcomed Britt's return with warmth, but even skepticism came laced with a sense of relief. Carly and Lulu, both women who had clashed with Britt in the past, could not ignore the significance of her survival. Though they did not erase their complicated history, they were not blind to the miracle in front of them. To their surprise, there was a certain softness in acknowledging that Britt had been granted another chance at life, even if their personal grievances remained unresolved. For them, her return was less about friendship and more about witnessing something extraordinary that forced them to confront their own notions of loss and forgiveness. Jason himself became a figure of quiet admiration, even among those who questioned his choices. The risks he took, the silence he endured, and the sacrifices he made underscored a loyalty that few could deny. He had not just brought Britt home, he had carried her through the abyss and refused to abandon her even when it meant confronting shadows that others would flee from. In the process, he reinforced his role as the guardian of Port Charles, someone willing to bear the weight of impossible missions for the sake of those he cared for. His return with Britt was not only a triumph of will but also a reminder that Jason's loyalty often blurred the lines between recklessness and heroism. Yet, beneath the joy and shock of Britt's survival, danger still lingered. The enemies who had sought her demise were not erased by her reappearance. In fact, her survival might provoke them into greater acts of desperation. Shadows moved quietly across Port Charles, watching, waiting, and preparing to strike when the city's guard fell. Britt's return was more than a miracle, it was a disruption to plans carefully laid in her absence, and those who thrived in secrecy were already calculating their next move. The reunion brought hope, but it also reawakened the very forces that had tried to erase her from existence. For Britt, the challenge was no longer just survival, but reintegration. She now had to navigate a community filled with fractured loyalties, unresolved grudges, and unspoken suspicions. Friends who once mourned her now struggled to understand her new reality, while enemies who thought they were rid of her would surely seek revenge. Her identity was no longer simple. She was both a survivor and a symbol of disruption, someone whose very presence threatened to unravel the balance of power in Port Charles. With each embrace and every wary glance, she felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her, reminding her that coming back was only the beginning of her true trial. Meanwhile, the emotional ripples extended beyond Britt's closest connections. Families who had lost loved ones to violence or conspiracy looked at her survival with complicated emotions. Some felt renewed hope, seeing in her a possibility that death might not always be final, while others felt bitter envy, reminded of the loved ones they could never reclaim. The collective heartbeat of Port Charles quickened, pulled between the joy of Britt's miraculous return and the unease of knowing that her presence stirred old dangers back into play. In the days that followed, Port Charles stood at the edge of transformation. The city had been gifted with an impossible return, yet it was clear that peace would not follow easily. The reunion of mother and daughter, the reluctant acceptance of rivals, and the silent admiration of Jason all painted a picture of resilience, but resilience came with a cost. As Britt settled back into her life, she carried with her the ghosts of the past and the looming shadow of enemies still at large. Port Charles was celebrating, but it was also bracing, because where miracles bloomed, peril always lurked nearby, ready to remind them that every victory came with a price. Second, Nina took it upon herself to sit down with Lulu and carefully unravel the layers of fear and confusion that had taken root since Britt's shocking return to Port Charles. Lulu's initial reaction had been one of pure disbelief, but disbelief quickly gave way to apprehension, especially when it came to Rocco. The thought of Britt suddenly reappearing in the fabric of their lives unsettled her deeply. She had built stability for her son after years of turmoil, and she feared that Britt's unpredictable nature might disrupt the fragile balance they had worked so hard to maintain. Nina, however, recognized the storm that was forming in Lulu's mind and sought to temper it with patience and reason. Lulu's anxieties were not unfounded. She knew Britt's history, her mistakes, and her complicated ties to the people of Port Charles. As a mother, her instincts screamed at her to protect Rocco at all costs. The idea that Britt, who had once been a disruptive force, might now circle back into their orbit was unsettling. Every memory of chaos resurfaced, and the possibility of Rocco being drawn into it was almost unbearable. Nina listened carefully to Lulu's concerns, never dismissing them, but also never allowing them to spiral into rash conclusions. She knew that fear left unchecked could become a dangerous guide, and she wanted Lulu to see the broader picture beyond her maternal instincts. In her calm and measured tone, Nina began explaining the circumstances of Britt's return. She detailed how Jason had risked everything to ensure Britt's survival, how the journey back had been one forged in pain, danger, and resilience. This was not the same Britt that Lulu remembered clashing with. This was a woman who had faced death and returned, forever altered by the experience. Nina emphasized that survival changes people, often stripping away old patterns and forcing them to reevaluate their choices. She wanted Lulu to understand that Britt's reappearance was not a threat by default but rather an opportunity to see whether a new chapter could unfold differently. Nina went further, pointing out that while Britt had made her share of mistakes, she was also someone who had shown moments of genuine care and vulnerability. Her complex nature did not erase her humanity. Rocco's well-being, Nina argued, would not be safeguarded by shutting out people prematurely but by modeling how to respond thoughtfully to life's unexpected twists. By painting Britt only as a danger, Lulu risked teaching Rocco fear instead of resilience. Nina's perspective aimed to show Lulu that navigating this return with patience and grace would be a far greater gift to her son than reacting with panic and hostility. The conversation turned toward Lulu's role as a mother and how her choices would echo in Rocco's perception of the world. Nina reminded her that children absorb more than words. They absorb attitudes, fears, and judgments. If Lulu met Britt's return with immediate rejection and visible distrust, Rocco would internalize that response, learning to cast suspicion without understanding. On the other hand, if Lulu demonstrated cautious openness while still setting boundaries, Rocco would witness strength rooted in fairness. Nina impressed upon her that this was not about letting Britt into their lives blindly but about choosing a path that reflected wisdom rather than impulsive fear. Lulu, still overwhelmed, struggled to reconcile her instincts with Nina's reasoning. The thought of Britt hovering anywhere near Rocco filled her with unease, but Nina's words began to chip away at the wall of resistance. Nina spoke of second chances and how Port Charles itself had long been a place where redemption stories unfolded. If Britt truly wanted to rebuild, there was space for her to prove it. Denying that possibility outright might protect Lulu's peace of mind for the moment, but in the long run, it could alienate her from others and even from her son, who might one day question why Britt had never been given the chance to change. To strengthen her point, Nina highlighted Jason's unwavering loyalty and the faith he had placed in Britt by bringing her back. Jason was not a man who gave his trust lightly. If he believed Britt's survival and return were worth the risk, then surely that said something about her growth. Lulu respected Jason deeply, and Nina used that respect as a bridge to soften her stance. She suggested that perhaps Lulu could lean on Jason's judgment while taking time to form her own. It was not about surrendering her instincts but about balancing them with the trust she already had in someone who had proven himself countless times. As the conversation unfolded, Lulu began to see the wisdom in Nina's guidance. The panic that had gripped her loosened slightly, replaced by a cautious acknowledgement that her fear might be amplifying the threat beyond what it truly was. She understood that Britt's return would always be complicated, but complication did not necessarily mean catastrophe. What mattered most was how she chose to respond. With Nina's steady counsel, she began to consider that patience, watchfulness, and measured judgment might offer Rocco the protection he needed more effectively than absolute rejection. By the end of their talk, Lulu was not fully at ease, but she was steadier. Nina had given her something invaluable: perspective. She no longer felt entirely cornered by fear but instead saw a path where her strength as a mother could coexist with fairness as a person. The future remained uncertain, and Britt's role in it was still to be determined, but Lulu now had the tools to face it without surrendering to panic. Nina's words lingered with her as a reminder that rushing to shut doors could sometimes create more harm than opening them with care. And though danger might still hover in the background, Lulu understood that her actions would set the tone for what came next, not only for herself but for the boy whose future she guarded so fiercely. Third, Lucas had been carrying a heavy sense of unease ever since Drew opened his eyes in the hospital. The relief of seeing him awake had been undercut by the strange way he responded to questions. When asked directly about the night he was shut, Drew faltered, his words halting, his eyes shifting as though he were torn between speaking the truth and keeping something hidden. It was not the reaction of a man confused by memory loss alone. It felt as though he was deliberately withholding. That hesitation triggered Lucas's instincts, and he could not shake the feeling that the circumstances of the shooting were far more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. As Lucas replayed Drew's fragmented responses in his mind, one detail stood out. Every time Michael's name came up, Drew seemed even more unsettled. His voice would trail off, his gaze would drop, and the tension in his body became unmistakable. Lucas, who had always relied on his ability to read people, sensed something beneath the surface. If Drew was not willing to say it outright, perhaps it was because the truth involved someone he was protecting. The thought gnawed at Lucas until it grew into suspicion. Could Michael have been involved in a way no one had considered? Unable to sit with his doubts any longer, Lucas approached Carly, hoping she could provide clarity. Carly, after all, was fiercely protective of both Drew and Michael. If there was anything hidden in the shadows, Lucas believed she might be the key to unearthing it, whether knowingly or not. His questions began cautiously, circling around Drew's condition, but quickly sharpened as he brought up inconsistencies in Drew's account. He asked her directly about Michael's role that night, framing it as concern rather than accusation, though his eyes betrayed the weight of his suspicions. Carly, unprepared for such pointed inquiries, found herself suddenly disoriented. She had been focused solely on Drew's recovery, clinging to relief that he had survived, and she had not entertained the possibility that Michael's actions might be called into question. Lucas's words hit her with unexpected force, leaving her grasping for answers she didn't have. Her confusion was genuine. She could not reconcile Lucas's insinuations with the Michael she knew, nor could she ignore the fact that Drew's behavior had indeed been peculiar. Her attempts to respond only highlighted her discomfort. Carly insisted she knew nothing of Michael being involved, but her tone lacked its usual certainty. She repeated that Michael had been as shocked as everyone else when Drew was found, yet even as she spoke, her own doubts began to creep in. Why had Drew hesitated? Why had his voice faltered when Michael's name surfaced? Carly's loyalty to both men pulled her in opposite directions, leaving her voice uneven and her composure strained. Lucas noticed every crack in her demeanor. The more Carly stumbled, the more Lucas's suspicion deepened. He pressed further, reminding her of how quickly Michael had appeared at the hospital and how guarded he had seemed in his updates. Lucas was not accusing outright, but he was relentless in pointing out details that no longer aligned. Carly tried to dismiss them as coincidences or products of stress, but her own uncertainty was betraying her. Each answer she gave seemed less convincing, as though she were trying to reassure herself as much as Lucas. Lucas's persistence came from more than curiosity. It came from a sense of responsibility. If Drew's hesitation pointed to a deeper truth, then allowing silence to prevail could put everyone in danger. He reminded Carly that secrets had a way of festering, and if Michael had been involved, even inadvertently, the truth would eventually surface. The sooner they understood what really happened, the better chance they had at controlling the fallout. Carly, however, struggled to see Michael through that lens. To her, he was still her son and perfect, yes, but not someone capable of orchestrating or covering up such violence. As the interrogation continued, Carly's mind raced with conflicting thoughts. On one hand, she wanted to shut down Lucas's line of questioning entirely, to defend Michael against any suspicion. On the other, she could not deny that Drew's silence had been troubling. For the first time, she found herself torn between her unwavering trust in Michael and her growing concern that Drew's recovery might unearth something she was unprepared to face. Her inability to give Lucas the certainty he sought only fueled his determination to dig deeper. By the end of their exchange, the room was thick with tension. Lucas left more convinced than ever that something critical was being left unsaid, while Carly was left rattled, her faith shaken in ways she had not anticipated. She could not escape the memory of Drew's hesitant eyes or Lucas's insistent questions. The seed of doubt had been planted, and though she wanted desperately to believe in Michael's innocence, she could no longer ignore the possibility that Drew's silence was a shield, protecting not himself but someone Carly loved. That possibility haunted her, leaving her caught between loyalty and truth, and sure which would demand the greater sacrifice in the days ahead. Fourth, Jason found himself in unfamiliar territory the moment he stepped back into Port Charles with Britt by his side. He was a man defined by clarity of action, someone who operated best in shadows where choices were straightforward and consequences immediate. Yet now, the weight of returning Britt alive, when everyone had mourned her as dead, left him uncharacteristically unsettled. The questions from those around him were relentless, and though he had faced far greater physical threats, the barrage of doubt, curiosity, and suspicion was a different kind of battle. He had always known how to fight enemies, but he was far less certain about how to navigate the shockwaves rippling through his community. The first wave of reactions was disbelief. Friends and enemies alike struggled to reconcile the sight of Britt standing alive with the certainty of her presumed death. Jason was pressed for answers. How had she survived? Where had she been? And why had he been the one to bring her back? Each inquiry cut deeper, exposing how little he himself truly understood. He had focused so much on the mission, on survival, on keeping her alive day to day, that he had not fully considered the implications of what would happen when they returned. He now stood at the center of a storm of unanswered questions that forced him to confront a reality beyond his control. Inside, Jason wrestled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, there was pride and relief. He had defied impossible odds to ensure Britt's safety, carrying her out of the darkness when everyone else had given up. On the other hand, there was a gnawing uncertainty about what her presence meant for both of them now. Was she truly free from the dangers that had nearly destroyed her? Would her return create new enemies eager to silence her for good? More personally, Jason questioned what role he was meant to play in her life moving forward. Saving her had been instinct, but staying beside her, should he, or could he? The questions from Port Charles mirrored his own internal struggle. People wanted details he could not fully provide. They wanted explanations for mysteries that even he did not understand. How exactly had Britt managed to survive? What forces had worked behind the scenes to keep her hidden? Jason had fragments of answers, enough to assure that the story was true, but not enough to satisfy the insatiable curiosity of a town accustomed to secrets and betrayals. His silence, though natural to him, only fueled speculation. Each unanswered question became its own rumor, and Jason quickly realized that he had brought home not just Britt but also a storm of uncertainty. His bond with Britt complicated matters further. Their shared experience of survival had created an unspoken connection, a reliance born out of necessity and tested in danger. Yet Jason was acutely aware of the fragile line between loyalty and intimacy. Was their bond temporary, forged by circumstance, or something deeper that demanded acknowledgement now that they were back in familiar territory? He could feel the weight of others' eyes measuring every gesture, every glance, waiting to decide whether their return was a mission's end or the beginning of something more personal. Jason also struggled with the role he would now play in her reintegration. Britt's survival was not just about her own adjustment, it was about facing the town that had already buried her. He knew she would face suspicion, hostility, and perhaps even rejection from those who could not reconcile her past with her second chance. Protecting her physically had been straightforward compared to protecting her from the judgment of Port Charles. Jason wondered if he could, or if it was even his place. Would his presence shield her, or would it only deepen the scrutiny both of them faced? As the days unfolded, Jason began to sense a widening divide between action and explanation. He had done what needed to be done, and that was the part he understood. But explaining why, filling in the blanks, and giving meaning to events that defied logic was not something he was equipped for. Port Charles wanted narratives, justifications, and closure, while Jason's world was built on instinct and survival. The clash left him adrift, uncertain of how to defend his choices without betraying his own nature. Meanwhile, the undercurrent of danger had not disappeared. Jason knew better than anyone that survival was not the end of the fight. Whoever had wanted Britt gone once could want her gone again. Their return might have disrupted plans too carefully laid, and those who thrived in secrecy would surely not take kindly to being exposed. Every glance over his shoulder, every unfamiliar presence on the street reminded him that the threat was not over. Jason's unease was not just about how to answer questions, but how to prepare for the storm he felt brewing. In quiet moments, Jason's thoughts always circled back to Britt herself. She was alive, but she was changed, scarred in ways both visible and unseen. He saw her determination to reclaim her place, but he also recognized the vulnerability beneath it. What unsettled him most was the realization that her fate was now bound up with his in ways he had not intended. Bringing her back was supposed to be a victory, yet it had left him with more questions than answers. Questions about loyalty, about trust, about whether the choices he made had brought safety or only delayed disaster. And for the first time in a long while, Jason Morgan did not know which path lay ahead.